Hello everyone, today we talk about the Burgundian flags of the 15th century. So sometimes even these secondary aspects are very important for military history because aside from the evident tactical importance that a flag can have for signalizing and therefore identifying one unit on the field, both for everyone involved, for giving orders to the various units and subunits, as we will see. And naturally, there was a huge amount of these various flags, banners, pinnacles. You didn't even know how to. Here we go with the dogs outside. Start barking regularly every time I start the video. The It's actually only one dog, but it makes the sound of three at once. And but also, such topic is interesting because it does show so much also about the bit of the culture, not just the military culture, but broadly meant also the it gives us back something that I think we largely lost, and also in our perception of that past. I mean, how that past was so you know dominated sometimes by certain beliefs. We'll see now there were lots of military saints depicted on Burgundian flags, which was totally normal at this point for every Christian army at the time. But also the rest of the heraldry and hidden symbolism, sometimes that are not even fully certain and clear to decipher. Sometimes the heraldry, certain symbols that also were very important for certain countries. Now, the Burgundians at this point we're talking about the Valois dynasty of Burgundy. These were essentially a branch of the Valois, or a royal Valois dynasty in France. Among the various symbols was the one of the sun. For instance, that has also these. Sometimes it's difficult to explain, like certain mottos that, for instance, Montjoie for the French king. It was Montjoie Saint-Denis. Well, Saint-Denis is pretty obvious. Montjoie, still don't know. So even such clamorous war cries and other symbolisms attached are difficult sometimes even to interpret. But the core of the also the element is how colorful this world was. We're talking about, for instance, now the 15th century. That was a moment in which there was the major use, military history of full plate armor. And also, it's interesting how much of also the later attention, think about the Pre-Raphaelites and so on, and especially in certain areas of Europe, this was actually the moment in which we stereotypically think the Middle Ages, as in this very highly already codified feudal and crystallized feudal world in many ways of the Ancien Regime and so on. But we mentioned this armor always kind of gray and and everything kind of dark, because the Middle Ages are dark. Come on, but just think about the colors. Something we have forgotten about the ancient world, as well as including the medieval world, is how colorful it really was. And these flags definitely highly contributed to that. But just full plate armor was painted sometimes. We actually have evidence of full plate armor painted, and all the symbolisms that existed into a society that was at this point still very diversified within itself, and it was a corporative society in many ways. Every group, every class, every corporate, every guild had its own codes, its own rules, its own symbolisms, in fact. And the world was still dominated by this highly diversified symbolism that, albeit having naturally certain elements in common. Think about St. Andrew's cross. The saltire at this point was prominently figuring also famously, for instance, in Scotland, but was also the symbol of Burgundy, and it passed to Spain, to Habsburg Spain, eventually through because of the Burgundian legacy of the Habsburgs. But it was a word that still pretty much relied on this symbolism, even as a sort of, an allegorical, and even cryptic, and I can say exoteric because it would be excessive, but it was not a secular world. It was not. It was heading towards some greater, form of secularism, if you want, towards the modern age, but we're still in a world was highly dominated by not just by Christian values, but also many symbolisms that were rooted in, even other traditions, and that still retain, I can't say a pagan root in certain elements, but definitely this reliance on kind of symbolisms is, if you want, a relic of that past, because otherwise Christianity is pretty tends to homogenize, just to standardize in practice everything. But even the same differentiation with warrior saints and this attachment to the single figure is a form of, it's how indeed Christianity also adapted to this world that had been dominated up to some century before, to a very different mindset. And why do we talk especially about Burgundian flags? Because objectively there are so many other elements of the that evidence and also preserved flags, because this is what we start having also at this point. White Burgundians, well, because in the case of Burgundy, we have actually an enormous amount of information about flags, and this stemmed from a sum of factors. First of all, there is a meticulous recording about this. The Duchy of Burgundy was, at this point, is sort of a state on its own in practice. It was formerly the duchy in itself was a fief of the French crown that had, but this branch of the Valois-Burgundy had basically expanded on its own, especially during the 100 Years' War, and the Burgundians often sided with the English during the conflict. And it's in this entries that very slowly Burgundy expands also in this kind of frontier area between the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire, that is the Flanders. So that this was Burgundy was a very fascinating combination of these two elements: the fully French feudal one of Burgundy that relied, on this chivalrous ideas. The Burgundian dukes were considered actually the champions of chivalry, the champions of Christianity. They were called to lead many crusades, especially the ones in the Balkans in these later times during the Ottoman advance. Burgundy was a kind of a standard of chivalry. It had a very intense and strongly chivalrous code. It's a code, obviously a chivalrous code. A code can be chivalrous, I'm sure, but this is not necessarily a code. It was actually the most prestigious court in Europe at this point. But it also combined this fully feudal mindset with the one of instead a very different area that was very much urbanized and organized in commonalities of burghers, of commoners, in fact. That was Flanders, that at this time was also one of the most technologically advanced areas of Europe. The Duchy of Burgundy developed a park of artillery before park of artillery proper before even the Kingdom of France did, because of the artisans and craftsmen of these Flemish centers. And eventually, that the story of Flanders is of the lowlands essentially was that when Burgundy was eventually wiped out after the Swiss wars by the French, that had basically shattered it, and by the with the French invasion that incorporated Burgundy, or at least almost all of it, only a very few parts went to the empire. The Flanders proper was inherited through the princely marriage by the Habsburgs. That from that at that point were still already still only in Austria. Then eventually there is other royal marriage at that point actually that brought the Habsburgs to rule also over Spain. But the Flemish lands were this kind of Burgundian legacy that lived on through the Habsburgs. Even if you think about Charles V of Habsburg was educated. He was born in Gand. He was educated in Flanders, and he considered himself a Burgundian gentleman. Burgundian noblemen. So this legacy of Burgundy remained, and among the various legacies it had, Burgundy had been famous for having been one of the most military advanced countries at one point. There is in this, especially in the second half of the, during the 15th century. Because it was forming a sort of state. I mean, it was so wealthy. Objectively, Burgundy has always been, the area that were very, very wealthy. Then, obviously, Flanders also were. So this was this very actually strange, if you think about it, statal entity was forming into the center of Europe between France and Germany, and that essentially was managed to structure a model that was a centralized model, was partially at least centralized, that was reflected into the military as well. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So there was this tendency to standardization, to structure the administration and having more an ability to control several the organization of also the military, that in this sense was very much ordered. And Burgundy, there is a lot of criticism. I made some video about, I think I made one video about the Burgundian army at this point, that was actually about the battle formations. It's in the medieval warfare playlist, and you know that there is a lot of criticism because eventually Burgundy collected a series of remarkable defeats, even being at this point one of the best organized armies in Europe, also drawing the best from some also the most advanced militaries of the time, were the French one and the Venetian one, and this was this tendency for to homogenization in part. I can't say fully standardization itself, but the main problem of medieval armies at that point was essentially the one of creating a degree of centralization and professionalism that could put an end to all the contingent nature of these armies. I mean, the idea that spreads into the modern age is you have to have at least a core of professional troops that depend directly from the crown, and that are not made up by just simple mercenaries, but are more controllable by central power. And so, especially Charles the Bold was, that eventually famously died also in one of these battles, was a bit of this figure which is considered one of the, from one side, one of the greatest military experts at the time, especially in logistics and organization, but at the same time also a great defeated of history. So the video I was searching for was Medieval Formations, Battle Order of Charles the Bold's Burgundian Army. So I'm personally never went thoroughly in detail with this, because I believe many times, of course, defeats can occur also when you are a good commander, you have a good army and so on. It doesn't, having the best armies of the best commanders doesn't, it's not enough by itself to win a battle or to win a war. But indeed, the astonishing series of defeats collected, especially against the Swiss, tell us that there was something that didn't work, and I think the main criticism can be made is essentially towards this anxiety of dynamization. I don't know whether it exists in English as a word, but it renders the idea of it, and at the same time of specialization or organization that is typical of the Burgundian army. So many different specialties, so many different options, tactical modules to use on the field and so on, but that eventually get clamorously defeated by what was still practically at this point a mono-arm army, a mono-arm military like the one of the Swiss. They didn't have a big deal of artillery. They didn't have a big deal of missile power. They didn't have a big deal of cavalry at all. They had just one thing. It was this infantry of pikemen that at this point was indeed transforming, especially from the 20s of the 15th century, into something very different from anything that had ever been seen into medieval warfare at that point, and also very different actually as a phalanx from even the one of the ancient war. Many people like to draw these parallelisms, but actually the Swiss and Macedonian phalanxes are something extremely different, the one from the other. You can't compare them. But aside from this, it's evident that there was something in the Burgundian military that eventually didn't work. And you can't take 3 or 4 major defeats that happen consecutively against the same enemy and pretending that this doesn't have a structural meaning of some sort. It can derive also from incredible misfortune and unluck, but you most likely, if you look at it, there is so much that basically probably didn't work. But still, the Burgundian military is considered one of the most advanced, and because it was kind of trying to surpass this kind of what we think as a medieval dimension of warfare, and heading towards a homogenization of the army. And part of this homogenization also came through the flags. I mean, the idea that the Burgundian army, aside from its naturally identity and for its military culture and identity and pride and so on of the House of Valois and etc., it also needed a certain homogenization in the usage of flags, at least the major ones, so to make the army belong sort of to a uniform system. That also in terms of signalization and tactical practice had to become increasingly homogeneous. So the Burgundian legacy brought us also partly this meticulous recording of the flags, and actually more than else, this great amount of information about Burgundian flags derives from all the vast masses of booty taken by the Swiss at this major victories that they achieved on the Burgundians at Héricourt, Granson, Morat, and Nancy. And so basically the Swiss collected this huge amount of flags captured by the enemy, that naturally, as you know, is also a great it's a great pride for an army to take these standards, because they're not just mere tools. They are basically the same symbol of the army. Taking a flag to the enemy means basically to take away its own identity, its own the pride of a unit. So naturally, these were preserved by these objects were kind of religiously preserved by the Swiss, and you can still see them, and it is not just the Burgundian ones. The Burgundians also fought against other entities and around, like Savoy, for instance, and there is an extent. The Savoy, there were Savoyard troops also fought within the Burgundian army against the Swiss as well. So also in here we should understand the kind of the strategical location and the strategical interests of the Swiss Confederation, but now we will talk about that another time. So for instance, at Battle of Granson, we have the capture of 600 Burgundian flags. This in just one battle. And that actually the flags captured Granson are also the greatest source we have about the Burgundian flags, in fact, and there is also there are also other sources, just like Schilling's of Lucerne's chronicles. that are often used. You've surely seen them sometimes on the internet. If maybe you don't know where from shilling. It's this beautiful chronicle with a chronicle beautifully illuminated. Sorry, with so many illustrations that depict, in fact, many interesting details about military history. Recently, I made a video, for instance, on the horses' full plate armor in the second half of the 15th century, and I think the very first element of very first evidence of that type of armor comes from Schilling's of Lucerne's chronicles, and the title, if you're interested, is it's full plate horse armor, second half of the 15th century. So the principal flag devices is in these flags were essentially St. Andrew's cross, the motto "Je l'ai empreint," and certain flints and steels and flames in abundance. Now let's analyze at least the first two that are kind of characteristic. So first of all, the cross of Burgundy. This is or cross of St. Andrew, that is known also, especially in Spanish, because of eventually, as we were saying before, the Habsburg legacy in Spain as La Cruz de San Andrés, and has basically this characteristics of as a saw-toothed, regularly formed St. Andrew's cross. That is a bit the distinguished one. It was firstly used into the 15th century, seemingly, by the as an emblem of the Valois Dukes of Burgundy, as we've said, and therefore you find it widespread, spread into this area, eastern parts of eastern France and the Low Countries, and the this herald symbol was inherited eventually, as we said, by the House of Habsburg at the extension of the Valois ducal line that lived on, however, in the female, through the female branch that eventually married the Habsburgs, and this was assumed eventually by the monarchs of Spain. That there were in this moment in which during the 16th century basically the House of Habsburgs ruled on these vast areas, not just in Europe but specifically here in Austria, the Low Countries, and Spain, during here the royal marriage, and the this inheritance was eventually found to be so it was so important that the Spanish monarchs continued to use in their own arms the symbol of the Burgundian house, and basically it remained from 1506 to 1701 the symbol of the Spanish naval, the Spanish Navy. And up to 1843 as the land battle flag. So, in fact, it's a symbol you find pretty extensively into the Spanish army during modern age, and and it still appears actually in several also to the Spanish military today, in with other with different regimental colors, badges, shoulder patches, and company guidon. And it's and this was spread also in other countries in Europe and in the Americas, interestingly enough. On the origins of this the cross represents essentially the cross where on which Andrew the Apostle was crucified. And this, as we were saying before, medieval Europe was full of these symbolisms, religious symbolisms, and this, and we don't have an exact understanding when basically it entered into the use of the Duke of into the heraldry of the Duke of Burgundy. As a matter of fact, initially it was believed that there was some kind of relation between the Burgundian the Burgundian usage and the presence of Scottish mercenaries into the Burgundian army. The Burgundian army at this point was extremely multinational in terms of where the soldiers came from. Where it was full of Germans, French, Italians, British. So it was actually very, very multinational army. But this was an opinion. It was stated into the 90s of the 15th century that, however, seems today not to have been really true, because such on base of chronicle accounts and archaeological finds, it seems that from the heraldic badges from Paris that there was a widespread adoption of the St. Andrew's cross as at that time, and it seemingly this symbol dated back to 1411 in a context, at least it appears in a context of factional warfare in the city of Paris proper. And after all, Saint Andrew was also considered the patron saint of the Dukes of Burgundy, so there had to be kind of other reasons. So relatively to Burgundy, we could go on with the Habsburg of Spain, etc. But today we stick to Burgundy, and this symbol was usually formed into the flags with either two ragged staves or two arrows points downward. The other element of these flags that figures prominently is, as we said, the motto "Je l'ai emprunt," which would be in the modern French "Je l'entreprends," I have undertaken it, substantially. So it was this augural form that figures prominently. Sometimes it was abbreviated to "gelé." Gelé. So I have it, practically, not even undertaken it, but just I have it. So it's a very decisive and also not really aggressive, but it gives the idea of this willing attitude, this push towards the forward in some way. So these other prominents were these flames and also globes and of sun, etc. This belonged also. This is a symbolism that derives from the actually the French, also the French crown. Or en flamme. So also in there, I don't think there is an exact understanding where this originally came from, but let's say this started to appear prominently, and it's important, the French connection, because still these were objectively the Valois Dukes of Burgundy, so they weren't a completely foreign entity. Sometimes it's difficult to reason in those feudal terms, but Europe at this point, especially in states like Burgundy, was dominated by such kind of more feudal allegiances than actual national identities, because Burgundy is one of brilliant example of a kind of a statual formation, that wasn't, however, based properly on any defined national identity. There was this essentially French duchy in the center of Europe. Then on the North Sea, the Flanders, and the Dukes of Burgundy did a lot also to homogenize this administratively these lands, and especially the Low Countries had derived from the Burgundian period a sort of a greater homogenization of kind of strengthening their own collective identity. That up to that point wasn't very strong, because these were lands that had been usually characterized by more of a sort of municipal communal mentality than kind of a national one. So at this point, also there is a proto-national strengthening of the a strengthening of proto-national Flemish proto-national identity. So there are, as we said before, many saints that appear on the Burgundian flags, on many of them actually, particularly Saint George. Saint George was depicted practically. Maybe before we go on, another word of this kind of standardization proper that I think it's important is, as we said before, the greatest military organizer of the Burgundian armed forces now is the Duke Charles the Bold. And he was aiming evenly to a certain degree of uniformity, especially among those troops that belonged to the so-called Ordinances. So the Ordinance was this sort of theoretically permanent army, in the sense that it had to be fielded, however, with a certain degree of speed, so certain speed and certain degree of homogeneity, and it had to work in a very kind of orderly fashion. So in here, the Ordinance represented a bit the cream and the bulk of the Burgundian armed forces, and naturally was full still into Burgundy of so many other military contingents coming from all the various communities and so on. And however, the Ordinance was usually wearing certain colors and having certain flags that, in fact, as we see from these finds, were reflecting that. The men-at-arms were ordered usually to wear blue and white plumes that were actually the ducal colors proper, and were supplied with the red crosses of Burgundy. And these were usually made of velvet and could be attached to their armor. Interestingly enough, so it was like badges, and showing this degree of this belonging, this idea, also matters of identification and so on. It seems that also in the Ordonnance, lighter troops like the couturiers and the archers. The couturiers were essentially light troops, usually light skirmish cavalry, and archers were given certain surcoats that were half white and half blue, and again with red crosses. And there is also evidence that the rest of the infantry of the Ordonnance wore certain blue and white ducal colors. So naturally we can't talk about the uniform proper. I mean, it really depends what standards you want to put to the uniform, but it's a form of uniformation, and usually these clothes were kind of were not even produced by the state proper. I mean, there were maybe just state provided certain material like the cloth, and then the was given. The unit was meant to color it by themselves, individually, even the single soldiers, and so the importance of the cross, especially of Burgundy, is great, as you understand, and they were a sort of field sign, appearing also in most of the flags. And although there is also pretty much universal emblem that we have seen, this stilized flint and steel, usually emitting sparks, so it is kind of a monotheistic picture, and this kind of standardization was evident also on the flags. The flags were usually ordered in a certain way. Also, the various companies of men-at-arms had certain cornets of and basically each company and sign had its own saint and color, So it's not that everything was of the same color, of course, especially the flags had to be necessarily different according to the unit, but there were still certain common patterns. The squadrons that made up the companies also had their own smaller coordinates, and they usually were ordered according to we'll see later to certain numbers that usually C then from C. We'll see that it would meant and there were even the unit numbers appearing on some of the flags, interestingly enough. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. And the motto, Je l'emprunte, all together. Relatively to the military saints, we were saying before, there were several figures also in here. Saint George being the most prominent figure, and although every ordnance company basically had similarly its own saint and color on its flag, as you've seen. Of these saints, some example are Saint Sebastian, that is depicted, found depicted sometimes in gold field, Saint Adrian in azure, Saint Andrew in red, like the cross, and Saint Christopher in silver. And sometimes these saints were also stilized into other into certain within a cartouche or panel near the staff. So also when the rest of the flag was depicting kind of something else, we find some other coronets, for instance, with Saint Jude wearing red and holding a pen and a white prayer sheet, and seated in brown chair against a white background edged in red with his name written in black. And so there were many of these various colors differences. I don't know how interesting maybe they are, but the also the prominent colors, as you understand, is this red and blue with kind of white also backgrounds, and this gold devices, and also everything edged kind of in gold, so to enrich it, to have it a noble the picture. There's other flags depicting St. Thomas, for instance, wearing brown and seated on a blue throne, and in that case it was a cavalry standard. And also in here you find other colors like a red field, and the certain extremities that are light and dark blue, and also in here with the edges and devices in gold. And other elements are in black. And these some of these flags are actually showed also in the shillings pictured battleground zone, for instance. So there is a coincidence. I mean, we are able to determine that this not just what we have left from the Swiss booty, but also from the from other iconographical evidence that these were actually the flags that were the symbols that were used. Another very important element banner is the one of Burgundy itself, and this is also very prominent among the Swiss booty, among all the various flags, and this was represented literally everywhere. On every kind of flag, in terms of every size of flag that is that it's there, and it's divided quarterly, and the first and fourth quarters represent the new Burgundy, with this color of azure, Saint-Denis, or sometimes with a border company of gold and argent. And the other one, the other quarters represent old Burgundy. a band of 6 Azure and or within a border gules. It also was impaled with Brabant, and the third being Old Burgundy impaled by Limburg. So also these had various colors. Now it's complicated. Maybe if you look at the pictures passing, it's kind of more evident. But this also with overall an escutcheon of Flanders, and Flanders, as we've this was a all these elements had a color. For instance, and a symbol. Brabant was in sable with a lion armed and langed gules, and Limburg was in argent with a lion, gules crowned and armed, and Flanders was or with a lion, sable armed and langed gules. So these were all figuring. And Flanders had been conquered by John the Fearless in 1419. So that's something that appeared from that point. Limburg and Brabant instead had been taken during Philip the Good, that it was Charles the Bold's father. So also in here the heraldry changed at every generation. I mean, you can argue that every duke, every nobleman at this point, because of these different various feudal inheritances added in several different codes, several elements into their own heraldry, into their own coat of arms. So this is also very important to date these flags sometimes, not just in the case of Burgundy, of course. And yeah, because consider that these people inherited at every generation something, either through the conquest or through marriage, in fact. So there was a great pride stemming naturally from the acquisition of such other holdings that were present on this, also on these flags. There are also rare examples of individual company flags, and it's interesting because we know that in France, during kind of the same time, in an ordinance of Charles VII in 1473, it was specified that every conducteur was to carry his own insignia with a distinctive design in color. And within the unit, the differentiation, as we said before, was to basically every chef de cadre, so chief of squad, was had certain a cornet basically had to be of the same color of the others, the same patterns of the others, but adding from 1 to 4 different numbers. That was that was divided according to bearing 1 to 4 C's to understand what the squadron was, and every okay, excuse me, I'm checking one thing now. These were other essentially other officers. The basically at least as we know, in 1473 there was a organization of the army at this point that basically every company of men at arms was divided into these 4 squadrons. So a cadre or a squad of 25 lances, each one comprising 5 chambers of 5 lances. So one was commanded by the chef de cadre, and the other 4 by chef de chambre. And 3 of each company's chef de cadre were appointed by the conducteur, the 4th being appointed by the duke, and it was the conducteur himself. So basically, in here instead, the chef de chambre had in turn other smaller flags, the banderole. So these were kind of long, narrow pennants, and the same design that had the same design of their helmets, and these were instead named from in like 101 to 104, like I in Latin to C2, I, and C, I, and V, basically, and or from double C1 to double C4, basically, and so on. So I know it sounds a bit complex, but I'm trying just to. These are kind of secondary aspects, but it's important because there was, in this sense, a great emphasis put on also the identification of the unit, also of subunits. So this should essentially tell us how how much emphasis was put indeed on the tactical interaction of these subunits, which is not a few, because we might think these medieval armies to be kind of disorganized. That's absolutely not. Sometimes even now they were too sophisticated. Like in the case of Burgundy, it was even kind of difficult to make it work all at once, basically. So it's so important to consider these aspects in internal organization to understand how these units fought on the field. So also this had kind of these predominant colors, like blue, white, blue, or blue over red, and there are so many other combinations of blue, red, and white that have to be found in Schilling's illuminations. And among these Swiss booty, we also have many Savoyard flags captured by the Swiss. The Swiss also fought against the Savoyards kind of on their own back in the south, let's say, in this area of southeastern France and northern Italy, and the northwestern Italy, and so the Swiss had this kind of natural enemies into these two entities. Actually, it was Burgundy that at a certain point decided to attack them, but they were also naturally expanding their own towards the north. Also, the Swiss Confederation, was kind of this sum of several cities that basically joined into this thing, trying to remain also kind of detached from these other proto-Stadal formations that were being created into the center of Europe, and the Swiss were part of the Kingdom of Germany proper. So they had also this. They had been born as a Landfried, essentially. So their objective was basically theoretically a defensive league, but sometimes they also went on the offensive practically. And they expanded against the Savoy. They basically conquered Lausanne to them. I mean, it was this kind of very progressive advancements into these strategical theaters, and that now we can't go into detail we can see into detail, but that, and the flag of Savoy is renownedly this being red and with a white cross and a green fringe that usually changes to red at the ends of the cross arms. And in fact, if you look at Schilling's manuscript, also for the Battle of Grandson, you find that there is a Savoyard cavalry unit bearing this small, nearly square red banner with a white cross. And sometimes these colors also were inverted. Other Savoyard flags were white with a red cross, although the Swiss records state that such flags were Savoyard, it seems that they might have been actually belonging to other troops into the Burgundian army. That might have been either English or Italian troops that also had this kind of colors. Thinking about England or Genoa, they have basically the same red and white. So we don't really know sometimes, and naturally, at that time for these people was relatively clear who was who. We have lost part of this also because we lost overall a general recording of what the whole picture really was and how these units also were. We don't know, for instance, how. I mean, sometimes we can understand maybe at a certain degree with this kind of uniform colors how these troops were kind of issued. These units were issued to have a color of some sort that was, however, something that usually pertained to the unit itself. So at this point, instead, it's the state that is also kind of enforcing it by a certain standards. So for these other secondary units, and we don't clearly understand whether they were just external units or whether there was a differentiation also on the base of especially in these lesser pendants that were actually smaller and had a higher degree of diversification, whether we're still talking about Burgundian units or external foreign units and so on. And there were also certain kind of hybrids between these, because even the same Savoyard flags at a point, at least part of them, followed the Burgundian patterns. So with ragged crosses, saints, and other typical Burgundian devices. So this is also very interesting because you might imagine the flag to be kind of also in here, kind of standard thing that is mostly related to tradition and so on. But sometimes, especially in this moment in military history, you have in feudal Europe so many different intersections, so many different, so many different, also kind of. Imagine these Savoyard troops, for instance, serving under the Burgundian dukes. They kind of they felt kind of thankful towards them, that they had to stress the allegiance towards their allies. So they kind of mingled the various insignia and using colors also of Burgundy and so on. So this is also interesting. There were naturally also many other contingents coming, as we were saying, from the most diverse areas of the Burgundian domains, chiefly from the lowlanders. And there is a Flemish motto that is very significant in this context. In one of these flags, that sounds like "eu plaisir." That would be "en votre plaisir," so at your pleasure. And this is very meaningful because obviously it means basically that these lowlanders were recognizing the lordship of the Burgundian dukes that naturally were kind of foreigner to them, but at that point were kind of serving, were their masters. And these this specific flag is embroidered in gold and blue field with the cross in brown. And this is a flag that was captured by the Swiss at the Battle of Héricourt in 1474. And there are so many other there is so much other iconographical evidence with other flags. Sometimes bearing just a cross, because that was the kind of the fundamental, essential symbol that was used at that point, without so many other details. This is important because objectively, probably this the most elaborated flags belonged to, in fact, to the Ordinances. It was a bit the elite of the Burgundian armies in here, and the most organized and so on. But while other troops had probably just mostly kind of other just recognition means, basic needs, so they didn't even need to stress excessively, where something else, just to be recognized from the rest of the either from friends and from enemy. And the cross at that point, that specific context was clear. Also consider how this designs were influenced also by the enemies we were fighting against, because naturally such symbols of saints, of certain other symbolisms were pretty widespread all over Europe. But I don't know, just think if Burgundy had to fight Scotland, they would have had similar symbols, so that maybe they would have tried to diversify it a little bit. So this happened also very, very progressively in a very pragmatic way that we have kind of lost, of which we have lost track. Just take Burgundy itself. Now we're lucky because all of this defeats that allowed the Swiss to seize and preserve these flags, but otherwise we don't know whether these patterns, these elements were present in the same measure also before, for instance. So these were also fastly evolving, as also armies were fastly evolving. So that were the problem also of being recognized on the field is something that has always been there, historically speaking, but it sometimes was not excessively important. I mean, the recognition also depended on how much a unit was in itself was tactically distinguishable on the field. So usually this kind of uniformity and greater attention towards certain uniform colors and so on is to be understood in the measure of how dynamic was the battlefield proper. We've seen it, incidentally. We were talking about this about the Battle of Delium, then talking about the Peloponnesian War. That was still war, for instance, was based on seasonal warfare. I mean, it was evolving towards some kind of a more dynamic dimension also on the field, because when you actually have your enemy in front of you, and the tactics are kind of relatively primitive, and you basically don't have any particular difficulty in understanding who's who in this, dichotomy. You don't need to identify yourself or the enemy in a particular way, because you know that what you have in front of you is the enemy. When things starts getting a bit more dynamic, for which there are more complex maneuvers, and there are troops that can also, the battlefields could be quite stretched. There could be a much more dynamic, especially the battles between the Swiss and the Burgundians kind of show this, that sometimes the Swiss arrived from directions that were not expected, was a lot of mobility. So also the importance in was not excessively difficult to identify the Swiss, also because they only fought in a certain measure, but especially within the Burgundian army, where there were so many different tactical specializations, it was important to know who was who also within the same army in order to command it. It was not just a matter even of being recognized, to be distinguished from the enemy. The real point is in the mass of a battle saying, okay, what unit is that, and being able to recognize it in a different way. And in this sense, it's the subunits of the companies here were named and numbered, especially, where it's kind of a very important thing, because in the mass of a battle you don't really go you don't have really necessarily the ability of saying, oh, what number is that on that flag. So that means actually that probably these troops had probably also an internal disposition we can't fully grasp, but it could transform itself into something tactically dynamic on the field, that required, at least up to a certain point, this need of recognizing the single units. But this was also normal. Also, realized that the strength of these units kind of varied wildly. Especially during a campaign, there is no every attempt of standardization, also numerical standardization, kind of is lost because there is these attrition factors, desertions, losses, and not everything is even the same colors are sometimes. If you campaign for some month, and you have these clothes of a kind of a certain color. After a couple of months, you're not gonna have them anymore because the uniform is simply going to melt away during this period. So it really depends on. There are so many factors that we're aware of, but that have to be always considered when looking at these colors and saying, okay, what did they actually serve for? There is also a kind of morale reason. If you are kind of all equipped with a single color, you don't just get recognized and so on, but it also stirs a bit the morale. It does have partially also this idea. I mean, we belong all to this color. It's our symbol, and also the enemy is frightened a little bit by the uniformity. The idea is that even an army that is able to look at these details, it seems that it's kind of a better organized army you have in front of you. This is also what a very overlooked aspect of the color uniform is that if you have in front of you enemies who even cared about wearing all kind of the same color, you say, my God, these guys are all the massive problems that can happen during a campaign, a battle. What they care also is they find the time and the will and the force to stress this uniformity. So it really means a lot to them, and that's also what the flag was meant to represent. It was the kind of the honor of the army, because it was bringing these figures of saints, patrons, and so on that were so important for the same identity of the unit. In terms of esprit de corps, not just as a mere indicator of what unit you belong to, theoretically. And there were many other flags, so everything was much less uniform than we'd think, especially this sub units mostly coming from all these various communities that made up in part the Burgundian army. Think about all the guilds that we have, evidence of goldsmiths and stonemasons sending their own troops, and they obviously show that the kind of their own they displayed on their flags their own elements, like certain vases or glasses and stuff like that, respectively of saws or hatchets, so something like that. So this was actually normal in all over medieval Europe, that the guild would display on the banner the color, the elements that recalled their own craft. Even though it wasn't just about that, because also the guilds were kind of complex communities, so they could have other symbols, like the normal the heraldry of some other symbol, or patron saints as well. And every unit was, especially its subunits, was full of these other variations that about which were not excessively documented, unfortunately, but that were there. And also here the colors variation could be really big. Mm. And but there seems to have been some also in here on maybe on some territorial base kind of prevalent colors. For instance, even if in spite of this variation, it seems that gold and silver or yellow and white, depending also on how these were realized, were quite prominent among these other units. But this could be also particular. So all these communities naturally belong to a certain culture, certain they spoke sometimes a similar language. They came from a similar, from the same region, so they had this I don't know how to say that, you know, communitary color that was part of still of a broader group, of a broader dimension. So this is kind of important also to bear in mind. So more or less, this is what I wanted to say. I'm sorry if I kind of explained poorly, especially the details. I could have made a video trying to list every single flag, but I think in this way was a bit also adding some other detail is kind of better, and just letting the pictures pass here. But whatever. So it's for now. I would stop here. And I don't know how many other videos about flags, and there are sometimes certain things about heraldry that are kind of fascinating as well, but I'm struggling to find certain books that deal with this in more than just a compilatory way, which is difficult because we are plenty actually of coat of arms of all sorts from the medieval times. The only problem is that when we try to to link them eventually to the broader system. I mean, we might have a coat of arms that we know because it's displayed on a tombstone, for instance. So fine, we know it perfectly well. We know now to which family it belonged. But as we've seen, there are so many other problems. First of all, sometimes we don't know what the colors were, because we have so many coats of arms. Whose colors not know, because it was maybe just engraved on stone. It was not painted. We don't have this was not recorded in other eventually in other collections of compilations of this coat of arms. So it's complicated and also maybe it goes by chunks, meaning that only certain areas of Europe are very well documented, depending on how those communities have preserved their own insignia, their own symbolism, and other areas about which we said we don't know really much. Heraldry is a extremely complicated field. It also is quite of a kind of underdeveloped. It's at least in certain countries I mean, there is a huge historiographical space and room for further research on these topics, because historically speaking was kind of was a sort of antiquary activity. Sometimes it was not even studied by historians proper, but just by antiquaries, in fact, and that sometimes stopped to a mere, in fact, compilation of such designs, of such and saying that's it. Like, this was the coat of arms at this point, and then there's been no further study about how this coat of arms originated, on how it eventually transformed, and so on. So it's way more complex than what is usually conceived, and so there is a lot of and there is material, I believe. I mean, in spite of these difficulties, I think there is still potentially a lot to research on it. The problem, people say, well, okay, but at the end of the day, it's just a symbol. What do we care? Maybe it's better to research on other aspects of the story, of this family or this community, for example, rather than actually spending time for figuring out what that symbol was. And definitely this is true also because of the aforementioned reasons that maybe you can't make a great research to know what was the coat of arms of a certain family, certain lineage, certain community at one point, but then you just have the evidence for one, for one generation, and then there is nothing about the rest, and you say, well, okay, I just have this kind of isolated knowledge, but it can be useful because this symbolism, I'm not making it a matter of just of saying of kind of studying genealogies, that it's also a channel through which heraldry is studied, but also trying to understand so many other things, including the symbol, the true meaning of the symbolism, because heraldry is something that's kind of developed very spontaneously, originally speaking. It wasn't even meant to be necessarily something dynastic in origin. This is also something that is often forgotten, that we think of feudal Europe as if the concept of dynasty, of lineage, had always been there and had always required these forms of symbolisms. And you can argue that heraldry is something that was born very ancient in times. Actually, I can say also in prehistory, but also depends. Take the Germans, for instance. They arrived to history only when they began to write. So after the migration era, in that sense, so pretty late in time. And surely, already at that point, a chieftain, a single warrior, had his own symbol, which doesn't mean that it was something prominently figuring and so on, but also I made recently that video on the Notitia Dignitatum showing all these different shield patterns that existed at that point into the Roman army, also showing the colors of the unit of certain federati, of certain Germanic federati in that case, and you realize that there was a symbolism already at that point attached to certain things. So sometimes this heraldry was also, we don't have to think it as the full feudal age where all the symbolism was crystallized, for which it was the symbol. No, because already still, I mean, at the end of the Middle Ages, as we have seen here, the coat of arms could vary generation from generation according to what the essentially the new patrimonial acquisitions of several properties, fiefs and so on, and titles, were happening. So it's really complicated. But at the same time, we have to remember that that world was based on these things. Like, that world was really based so much on this kind of particularism that these symbols represented, and these were present literally at every corner of the street. I mean, every house even had its own mark, and so this also was pretty transversal. It was not just about the nobility or a military unit, so this is something that went beyond that. And that intersected therefore with these other needs that usually could be also different. So this is why certain flags, the heraldry also is important. So I'm quite undecided, because I could make a list of certain shields, for instance, but the question would be, but okay, what do you do with it? It would be pretty kind of extrapolated from its context, and I'm not sure whether it would be actually very, very interesting. Because also today, let's be honest about it, I think it's more interesting what I've said in the last 10 minutes than what I actually listed before in terms of what color that single flag had and all the various details, because it's just a piece of an extremely fluid system that we don't ultimately know that much. So even listing them has a relative meaning in part. So okay, I'll see what I can do, because there are still many important things about heraldry that are kind of heraldry in itself was a very late, it was a discipline developed very late, because up to a certain point nobody even cared to classify the symbols. So also in here we should see what is modern heraldry, what it should transform really into, and who is studying it aside, because it's mostly not historians really. But whatever, this is maybe not important for now. I just hope, and I will keep definitely talking about the Burgundian army, because that's one of those chapters you don't want to miss. I still haven't talked much about many medieval battles, for instance, but there were many, and especially these victories of the Swiss against the Burgundian army are very meaningful also for the history of the European military and the evolution of warfare at that time. So let's just take such secondary topic videos like the preparation for something bigger, and that will just kind of stay as a detail if you're interested to know, and that can be useful in some way. So for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.